Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to it. Welcome back to early morning, right? It's about 7 a.m. right now, trying to get this bad boy up before y'all get to school. It was a little, crazy intense yesterday. Going to go ahead and just post it this morning rather than trying to quickly record it yesterday. Also went through, did some edits, made this a little bit more comprehensive, cut some things out that really didn't need to be there and stuff like that, just kind of make it a little bit easier. Now, remember, though, okay, I know that this unit is going to be a little bit difficult to study for due to the fact that it's not like things happening, right? Now, we're going to talk about some stuff today and some things I added to this Prezi to actually make it a little bit more understandable about specific things and other things like that and stuff like that that you can specifically reference whenever you have the ability to write a DBQ or a long essay question or possibly a short answer on the AP test if one comes up about the Industrial Revolution. But where we left off in class, we were talking about the industrial working class, right? We spent the last flip talking about the industrial middle class, the rise of the new social class, started talking about economics, started talking about the growth of industry in Great Britain, and we are still primarily focusing on that first phase of the Industrial Revolution. First wave industrialism. Second wave industrialism isn't going to come until the later 18s. The AP curriculum wants me to teach it to you right after this, but I'm not going to do that because I think that's extremely confusing. Now, getting into it, though, we talked about the industrial working class. We talked about if you're going to pick one or the other to send your kid to school or send your kid to work, 9 times out of 10, these working people were sending their children to work, right, if they had the money to afford it. Isn't that right, Grace Williams? Now, going into it, though, also we talked about how the first factories were put up in the countryside, mainly due to the fact that it had access to running water attached to water wheels as a form of power and things like that. And then later on, whenever people are trying to be encouraged to go into those places to actually have factory work, they're going to be reminded of English poorhouses, these terrible, disgusting things that even Charles Dickens ended up spending time writing about. So going into it, though, we left off talking about there was a lot of early reluctance to working in those factories, right? People did not want to work in them. They didn't want to go inside them because they were feared them from both their outside look and what they had heard what happens on the inside of them as well. How your children could be beaten by an overseer, or that you're going to make meager earnings, or you're going to whatever. Now, funny enough, when this all starts happening, these factory workers start actually offering a very good wage for working in these factories to try and coax people in on a large scale. And eventually it does work, right? And the industrial working class does grow significantly, and you're going to see the downfall of the putting out system, and you're also going to see the downfall of the cottage industry as well. And you're going to start having a very romantic view growing up factory society. We're not going to talk about these guys right now, Wordsworth and Blake, but what you need to understand is that going on in the background right now, in England, throughout the continent, and everywhere else, there is beginning to be this trend called Romanticism. And we'll talk about that actually this week as well. Romanticism is going to be a great day when we come in and look at pretty stuff, right? We're going to look at gorgeous art, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to really, really dive deep with it and stuff like that. And we're going to discuss how the industrialization of both Great Britain and then later the continent is going to lead to this very intense view of nature and this very, very intense view of the working man and how he's being forced into these factories and vice versa and stuff like that. So just keep that in the back of your mind, that there is this growing romantic view of factory society, right? But you're also seeing this really, really large uprising against factory work, period, right? So you had these people pop up apparently in the late 1700s during first wave industrialism called the Luddites, right? Or the Luddites is what they're actually called. Mainly because there was this story of this guy named Ned Ludd, right? So this guy right here is named Ned Ludd. Ned Ludd is wearing scraps and pieces of things that he has stolen from mills and factories, and as you can see in the background, the factory is burning. Now, the way that it goes is that apparently Ned Ludd was so infuriated with the growing factory system that he actually ran into a factory and started breaking down the machines and burning them. And this led in the early 1800s to a rash of actual people running into factories and destroying modern machinery. These were craft workers and cottage workers and people that did not want to work in the factories and saw the factories as coming in and destroying their way of life, right? So as you can see, the Luddites are a great example of early reluctance to going into those factories and early, and I just love that idea. I love the fact that, we should all be Luddites. We should all just grab our axes and run into factories and stuff and break things. And I know McKenna Ural is probably a big fan of this idea. Now, getting into it, though, also, the problem is that the Luddites are going to be a temporary phase. And money and the fact that people are beginning to move into these factories and seeking work in droves, also due to the fact that the agricultural revolution is now taking full effect and that the enclosure movement is now taking full effect. And so not as many workers are needed out in these countrysides, factories are going to be able to find very, very easy and very plentiful working populaces, right? So eventually people began to move into factories seeking work in droves. This is going to lead to massive urbanization, as you can see on this chart right here. So starting in the 1750s, or right around 1750, right when we can say that this Industrial Revolution was beginning, you actually had a very low level of urbanization. But as you can see, this is the growth of Manchester's population. By 1860, it is all but basically quadrupled, more than quadrupled actually, and it is exploding mostly due to the fact that there's so many people moving into these cities seeking work in these factories to avoid actually being crippled underneath the downfalling agricultural systems in the countryside, right? So going into it though, you're also going to see the growth of this experience. You're going to see this idea, the growth of poor families that are forced to turn to these factories and go in there to find work, right? So in the 1800s, the early 1800s in particular, factories didn't move permanently from the countryside into the cities due to the advent of steam power. You're going to see the steam engine be attached to looms. You're going to see it attached to spinning machines. You're going to see it attached to all kinds of other new automatic devices that do not require manual labor or hard labor, especially from men, anymore to actually operate. And what you're going to see is that men's jobs are going to be focused now much more in iron forges and shipping yards and places like that, whereas now inside the factories a heavy amount of women and children are being employed in them, along with some men as well, but just the population of working bodies was mostly women and children in the early textile factories. Now in your iron factories and things like that, it was a little bit different. Now you had a new variety of jobs in these cities. You could go into a factory. There was also side work that you could do. Many women would turn to seamstressing and maybe possibly doing other odd jobs on the side to try and find work there as well. Now here's another interesting little thing. Families are going to enter factories not as individuals, but as entire units. Literally what would end up happening at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution is the father of the family or the mother of the family, if the father had died or was actually unable to work, would actually have a negotiation with a factory foreman on hiring the entire family so that they could all work together, right? So as we talked about earlier, parents welcomed child labor early on, right? And the biggest places you saw factory worker intense family work going on was in cotton mill work and then in coal mine work, right? So as you can see, there is a mother and a child here working together. As you can see in this other picture, there is mother and children working together. So the big thing is all members of the family, including mothers and children, were often employed in English textile factories, right? So getting into it, yes, parents asked for child labor early on. They preferred it. They wanted it, right? Now, here's an interesting little facet that is going to end up popping up. Then the middle class is going to get involved. So looking at the understanding of factory work and the growing industrial population and the growing industrial revolution and things like that, you're going to start seeing this thing happen known as liberal reform from the middle class. You're going to start seeing the middle class who is now living a different life, completely separate from these factory working and regulations, are going to start trying to be altruistic and enter into these factories and start trying to save these working class people, right? Now, ironically enough, early on, they weren't asking to be saved. They were actually very happy with the fact that they were making wages and they could afford things. They could possibly reinvest that money into their children's educations later on if they had the ability. But interesting little things are going to start popping up is when the middle class begins a crusade of trying to help the working class. Now, granted, they are going to start seeing popularized images of working children covered in coal dust, children's hands being broken by textile machines, right? The most common injury in these textile factories was when these children had to reach their hands into these threading machines and untangle the knots, right? As you can see, the woman is steeped over here, right, as well, reaching into this power loom. Dad is over here operating the entire manual press, and the children are supposed to be picking up scraps. This child is coming out from underneath. And then also you can see right here as well, you're going to see these knots. These things can get knotted up. Those cords can get easily tangled, and children's hands were often used to actually reach in there and untangle them. Now, the other big thing you're going to see, though, as well, is you're going to see children being involved in mine work, being used to get inside of very small spaces. But here's the interesting thing. Coming in to this liberal reform period, you need to understand we're going to talk about three particular pieces of liberal reform during this Prezi. when we get to liberal reform as a whole in Great Britain, be ready to kind of take these ideas and shift them over. I learned this little trick from Marie Rowley last year when she figured this whole thing out, okay? Factories Act of 1833 is a great example of early liberal reform by the middle class, okay? They made a law in England saying that children between the ages of 9 and 13 could only work 8 hours a day. Reasonable. That actually 14 to 18-year-olds could work 12-hour shifts. Not so reasonable. And that all factories were required to have elementary schools for workers under 9. Now, that's a really interesting facet, okay? So look at what the middle class is trying to do. The middle class is attempting to make the lives of the working class better. Well, what's going to happen is the upper middle class and the upper class are going to decide to just stop at hiring children then, right? Because if I have to provide an elementary school for them, or if I have to provide other things for them, I'm just going to refuse to do it, right? And so this is going to directly affect the ability for families to stay around and stay present and stay like in the working sphere. And we'll talk about that stuff here in a minute when we get to separate spheres of gender and gender labor. Now, the positives of the Industrial Revolution when we're looking at everything is you do have more wage earning power throughout the home. Apparently, people would like wear 10 pence like notes in their hats and like demonstrate the fact that they could now go out and buy a beer in a tavern for the very first time because they were making money, right? You had the ability to buy minor life luxuries. Now the entirety of European society has the ability to be involved in that consumer revolution. You have wages rising during times of peace, right? You have wages going up especially when the working force numbers are going down, right? When you actually eliminate most child laborers due to like different acts that are coming along, like the Factories Act of 1833, you're going to end up leading to like a decrease in the labor population, leading to the fact that labor is now more costly because of the supply and demand of it. You're going to see clothing and diet are going to improve. You're also going to see a lot of negatives though as well. You're going to see massive amounts of child labor. You're going to see people working 6 days a week, oftentimes 11 to 16-hour shifts, right? You're going to see wage stagnation, especially like happening aggressively during the second Industrial Revolution. Now, I know some of you are probably a little bit confused when you're looking at, well, how did wages rise during times of peace and then they stagnate? Well, wages during the Industrial Revolution in the first phase rose often. But once you start getting into the mid-1800s, they start to stagnate, right? As in they got up, and then kind of plateaued, right? And I mean, that is actually happening in our society, even in the modern era. We'll actually look at some graphs and talk about what stagnation is a little bit tomorrow. Now, looking at it as well, housing market and food price fluctuations are going to happen. And these things, housing market and food prices, are only truly going to affect the working class. They don't really affect the middle class because these costs are seen to them as inconsequential, right? Now, going into it, though, you're also going to see the growth in these ideas of what we would call the gender division of labor, okay? Now, what's going to end up occurring because of a lot of these acts that are coming through, because of a lot of this liberal reform coming through, is that you're going to start seeing the growing idea of separate spheres, right? So now that children are going to not be heavily like employed in factories going into the 1830s anymore, especially in Great Britain, not so much on the continent yet. But once that actually begins to occur, you're going to see children not being allowed to work. They now have to be at home. So you're going to see mothers end up taking up work in the home space as much as they can if they don't have the ability to work in a factory, right? So going into it, you have these women that are actually being like, oh, well, I'll take on seam sewing. I'll take on like laundering. I'll do some things at home, right? That I can actually get some things going on in a little bit of a different way. But what happened if you were a young unmarried woman, a widowed woman, a woman with a sick husband? They are going to have to keep working, right? So it's a very interesting kind of dynamic that's going on, is that the middle class was trying its best to be kind to the working class, but it's going to end up actually affecting them in a negative way because you're going to see the growth of the separate spheres of gender division, right? That men are going to be the breadwinners and that women are like a wife at home and they're mothers, right? So like whenever you're looking at this understanding is no matter, like this is what it is about economics, no matter how hard you try, someone's getting stepped on, right? So even also though, if you were somebody that had to work because you were young and unmarried or widowed or with a sick husband, you could only earn meager amounts of money because this is also going to set up a growing gap in pay. All right, so go ahead and jot that down somewhere. The pay gap arises, right? So you're going to start seeing the growth in paying women less for the work that they are able or willing to do, right? So you're going to see meager earnings come out in textile factories because women are going to be used to operate the machines, right? You're going to see laundry services get paid very, very little, and maid services be getting paid very, very little as well. Now, why did this happen again? Again, referencing back to the Factories Act of 1833 with children now being at home having to be watched. And then on top of everything else, where was the one place if you didn't want to work in a textile factory that you could work and make a ton of money? We glossed over it a little bit in the back. It's called the coal mines, right? If you worked in the coal mines, you could make a good amount of money. You could make a very, very good living, but it was very dangerous, right? You were pushing 500-pound carts underground. There could be a gas leak and an explosion. The mine could cave in. You also were working in extreme heat, right? So in this understanding, you got to understand you're working in so hot of an environment that it was actually very, very common for a lot of the people working in the coal mines to disrobe, right? To take off their shirts or try to lose some layers of clothing to be able to stand the heat. And apparently, middle-class people, especially middle-class women, were appalled by this because there were actually teenage and working women, teenage women and adult women working in these mines, missing parts of their clothing, not wearing shirts and things like that. And when middle-class women observed this, they were like, but there are men down there and they're insatiable, disgusting men that will take advantage, which ironically enough, these women were not actually working really around their random men. They were working around their family members, right? So that's going to lead, though, to the Mines Act of 1842, which outlawed women from working below ground and all boys underneath the age of 10. So as you're seeing this liberal reform, again, liberal reform alert, right? So is going to try to do its best, but we're seeing a growing sphere of the middle class lives this lifestyle and the urban working class needs to work, but now is being limited in the amount of work they can do, right? So it's a very, very intense society occurring, but a lot of these liberal reform acts, which were meant to be good and kind in the first place, are going to have some negative effects, right? So going forward as well, you're also going to see some early labor movements pop up, and the labor movement, i.e., is a union, right? So now for those of you who don't understand what a union is a collaboration of worker or a combination of workers that come together that try to set standards for their labor, right? So for example, I was a part of a teachers union in New Jersey when I used to live there. We had the ability to lobby and make sure things happened, right? For example, if my principal wanted to meet with me and I thought she was going to be mad at me, I could have a union member to come in there and I wouldn't have to speak a word. My union rep would speak to them for me, right? So unions are organizations meant to protect a worker, and we'll get into that a little bit in a minute. But when the Industrial Revolution starts up, the unions are going to grow out of the idea of the old guilds, right? How to protect your labor, how to protect your craft, right? Now, this is going to lead to, in the early part of the Industrial Revolution in 1799, to these things called the Combination Acts, right? The Combination Acts outlawed groups like amalgamated societies or unions, right? These Combination Acts outlawed the progress of unions to try and prevent them from stifling the growth of the Industrial Revolution. So when you saw these new advents coming out, the steam engines, railroads being built, the increase in cities and things like that, the British government intervened and was like, we got to make sure that these workers don't get together and slow down progress. So they actually outlawed them in 1799. But in 1824, they're going to be repealed. So as you can see, 25 years later, things are changing, right? Now, a lot of this goes hand in hand with massive urbanization. A lot of it goes hand in hand with the fact that you can't stop them, right? Because workers are going to actually get together no matter what. And the earliest unions are going to be organized. Then they're going to perform strikes. They're going to limit the use of apprentices. They're going to regulate their work. They're also going to begin to lobby for better pay and more fair treatment, right? So granted, yes, we have the division of labor going on, but at least we have the growth of unions going on, which are trying to pay those earning men a better wage, right? Eventually, though, these are going to grow into legitimate unions that are going to be heavily politically active and actually be able to be people that can lobby elections and actually get heavily involved in the government and the infrastructure of societies as well. For example, this one right here is the Amalgamated Society of Carpenters, right? So these are carpenters from Great Britain. This right here is the Amalgamated Society of Woodworkers. And right here, this is the Amalgamated Society of Papermakers. So as you can see, all of these people are coming together and they're beginning to lobby for their labor and lobby for their work. And so they're trying to use that as their ability to get better pay and better treatment, right? So like the industrialization of the continent, though, is the last thing that we're going to leave off on, right? So this is a really big title, real big title. We'll have a little bit more to talk about, and then we're Dunskies, okay? The industrialization of the continent, though, is going to be very important because it's going to be very slow, and it's going to happen in many different countries. And remember, Abigail Winningham, everything moves in waves. That's right, Sam Johnson. Everything moves in waves, right? So we know that the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain, and then it waved its way through the continent slowly. Now, granted, this wasn't like very quick nor fast, right? Because you had a lot of issues that were preventing industrialization going on in the continent. Because Napoleon is just going to leave in 1815, and everyone's going to have to pick up and clean up from the massive Napoleonic Wars that have been going on for the last quarter century, right? Well, the Napoleonic Wars haven't been going on for the last quarter century, but for the last massive amount of wars that have been going on for the last quarter century. And you're going to see the growth of inflation. You're going to see property destruction. You're going to see money for investment. Post-steam power was not there nearly as much as it needed to be. Revolutions are going to slow things down. Secrets don't make friends, and we'll talk about that one here in a minute, right? Because the British were literally keeping this stuff secret. Now, so like also war and Napoleon in general, right? So like all these things are going to stand in the way of the industrialization movement occurring in the continent, right? And so 1815 is going to serve as kind of that starting line of when the industrialization movement truly begins to pick up in the continent. I'll show you y'all that on this graph here in a second. And the idea is we got to start figuring out some way to get these ideas from Great Britain, right? So looking at this little like graph down here in the corner, you can see that Great Britain with this green line right here is going to massively just skedaddle, like, and they're just going to blow up. This is their level of industrialization. Look how far they left everyone behind for decades on end. So as you can see, starting in there about here in about 1760s, 1740s, they're going to begin to grow and outpace the entire continent for quite some time. So they are literally at the rate of 20 per capita level industrialization, while the other continent, when they're just getting started, is less than half that, like closer to 10, right? Now, you can see the United States of America is going to be the only one that ever ends up passing them. A lot of that has to do with later on, going into the 1900s and World War I, and we'll get to that stuff a little bit later on, but you also got to look at this one right here. That's sneaky little Germany, right? So, like now, the big thing about it, though, is as you can see looking at that, these other countries really industrialized at different rates, though, right? So you got France, who never, like, industrializes pretty quickly, but you've got a lot of other places, like Russia, for example, that doesn't industrialize nearly as fast as everybody else, right? So you've got all those different things standing in the way, but you also have some other really important things to talk about as well. When you talk about the agents of industrialization in general, you have to understand the reason why I call it the agents of industrialization is because literally there were people that were directly responsible for spreading these industrial ideas throughout that of Europe. A good example is the cockerels, right? So like British technology and workers were selling secrets to European countries around the late 1700s, right? So in the 1790s, this family called the Cockerells moved to France, and they are actually going to start designing some of the first weaving devices that are actually mocked off of the British ones. They're also going to start designing some of the first steam engines that are mocked off James Watt's design. And they're going to illegally leave Britain under the threat of arrest, and they're going to start selling those ideas in the continent, right? So you're literally going to see people leaving and breaking those British laws in the early 1800s, right? And then also, eventually, as that ball continues to roll forward, and the British realize that there's no way they can keep their secrets anymore, they decide to just start showing off, right? So this place right here is a good example of that. This is the 1851 Crystal Palace, right? So that right there was an exhibition hall that was built in Great Britain to demonstrate and show off the advent of the Industrial Revolution to the world. It was made completely out of glass and steel, and literally it was a world's fair of industrial goods. Because by 1851, the British realized, whatever, they're going to start industrializing now. We just got to stay ahead of them, right? So and they did that very, very successfully. But you're also going to see a different type of industrialization occur in the continent. You're going to see government-supported industrialization on the continent. Whereas everything back in Britain was almost privatized, where it was certain companies and private individuals that were getting involved in this support, and that was actually happening in Great Britain, you're going to see a very different type of development in the continent. You're going to see tariffs try to protect continental goods and try to prevent them from buying British goods that could be bought at a cheaper rate because they were coming out of more industrialized factories, right? But tariffs are going to be raised on British goods to try and make it so they can actually protect their own products, right? You're going to see railroads in other countries be laid quickly because they're going to be laid by governments, not private companies. You're going to see industry become tied to national pride, right? Which is going to be like an economic nationalism idea, which is going to lead to the heavy growth of different industrialization movements in the continent. And then also, you're going to see this bad boy right here, limited liability protection. One of the biggest reasons that industrialism occurred in the continent is because corporate banks got involved with it, and they made it so you only would possibly lose your investment. But we'll pick up on the corporate liability stuff here in a little bit. When we talk about that tomorrow, I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.